this evening. When we were planning this meeting, we didn't anticipate February the 8th. But I'm delighted to have you here, and I'm really very pleased that Minister Richard Bruton has agreed to come this evening, and that he's honoured his promise to come to Rathfarnham, because we're all out on the canvas tour, as you can appreciate, and I want to thank the Minister for taking the time to come here this evening. And I think it indicates that Minister Bruton's commitment to his climate action brief, and we're delighted to have him here and to present us with the ordinary things that we can all do in our own lives every day to address this big problem that we have in the world, the problem of climate change. Richard Bruton has served as Minister for Communications, Climate Action and Environment since October 2018. He has been a TD for the Dublin Dail North constituency since 2016, and previously from 1982 to 2016 for the Dublin North Central constituency. And I think this indicates a man who has given great service to our country. Ladies and gentlemen, well, please give us a big round of applause and welcome.
I started my political career off the back of a truck, so I'm well used to addressing people without mics. First of all, I'd like to say I'm delighted to be here. I mean, this is the biggest topic in my view in any election, and certainly in this election. I think that there is, of course, a lot of fear and anxiety out there about climate, which is understandable given the scale of the challenge. But I think Irish people can take heart that in the last decade we have done things that would have been unimaginable 10 years ago. Our capacity to change our constitution in a profound way was really significant, and our capacity to take an economy that was 15% unemployment to return to full employment. That took enormous ingenuity by workers, by enterprise, by public servants, by many people to get that momentum. But all of that effort will have been at naught if we don't address the climate challenge that is ahead of us. But I think some of those achievements gave us a sort of a pathway to see how could we get real momentum behind the climate agenda. And one of the things we drew inspiration from was the Citizens' Assembly. That had been very successful in previous difficult issues around, for example, constitutional change. And that was we chose that to be the start of the real commitment to create a climate action plan. And it was those 100 ordinary people taken in off the street who would set the signposts as to the urgency and the direction of travel that we needed to take. That was followed by long hours of scrutiny by the Oireachtas of those giving evidence. And they came out with what was almost unique in an Oireachtas of this makeup, unanimously endorsing not only our report of the Oireachtas Committee, but endorsing a climate emergency and the urgency of doing that. And that was the foundation that allowed us build the climate plan that I have a summary of here in my hand. But it is the first time we have a very clear pathway to deliver the 30% reduction that we had committed to by 2030. As you probably know, the European Union is now recognising that that may not be enough and working on how do we up that ambition, and we will have to be a part of that. But we now have a climate action plan. We have it in place. It has the capacity to deliver the various targets. And to give you an idea of what's involved, just, I suppose, some big numbers. We aiming to have 4 times the amount of renewables on our grid by the end of this decade. So that's a massive expansion of wind power, solar power, and the introduction of offshore capacity onto our system. Big changes will be needed to make that a reality. A second big number, I suppose, is 10 times the amount of retrofitting that we're doing today in our housing stock. We need to deliver over the decade. So 10 times the activity. Retrofitting will become a major industry here for those who are interested in, I suppose, enterprise opportunities. It will be a 2 billion industry retrofitting our stock. And we need to continue that. It will take us more years than just this decade to achieve what needs to be achieved through retrofitting. We will have to see 25 times the penetration of electric vehicles today in the new cars coming onto the road. Today, we have just 4% of new vehicles, more or less, are EVs or plug-in hybrids. There are others that are hybrids which are not plug-in hybrids. We need to see a massive step up in that. And that takeoff, we believe, will come around 2024 when the technology will facilitate it. But this year, 2020, we will be doubling the public charging network to give people more confidence in their capacity to switch to electric, confident that the so-called range anxiety won't be a problem for them. Another big area where we have to change is our own land use, our forestry plantation. 250 million trees we will need to put in over the period to 2030. We will have to look at our waste and how we manage resources. Resources are probably the biggest thing that drive carbon emissions. We need, for example, to reduce our dependence on packaging waste. We need to remove non-recyclable plastics entirely from the supply chain. At the moment, 2/3 of the plastics we use are non-recyclable. So there's big changes that will be needed in the way we manage our household waste, and particularly companies manage their waste. And like we said, in a catering establishment, the catering industry is probably one of the greatest offenders when it comes to food waste. So the standard we've set that by the end of this decade, we'll have our food waste, and that's something that can be a win-win. I suppose in devising the strategy we put in place, the way we approached this was to identify a pathway that would deliver what would impose the least burden on people. But of course, nonetheless, there are burdens that come. And we've seen at the very sharp end what has happened with the decision to close down the 2 peat stations in the Midlands. That is a real part of this, and we have recognised that just transition has to be a key element. We have to make sure that as we bring these changes, we also treat people fairly, and particularly people who either don't have the capacity because of low income, or who are at the sharp end in terms of closures or changes in as we decarbonise our economy. And that's why we have introduced a Just Transition Fund. Another key element of what we must do to make this happen is the introduction, as you saw, of carbon pricing in the last budget. I think anyone who recognises the damage that's done by carbon emissions will recognise that under the polluter pay principle, we have to start recognising that things that we take for granted, sitting into our car and driving, that has a hidden impact on the global environment. And we need to move to a point where that's recognised openly by people in the price they pay for different items. And that's the thinking behind the carbon price. It will rise steadily from the level of 20 euros a tonne that it was last year, now 26 euros a tonne, up to 80 euros a tonne. And indeed, that expectation is that trajectory will go on. We're using every cent that is raised from that to help the transition. So that money will go into, has gone into in the last budget, either Just Transition Fund to support those people who need to make the change, supporting in particular people on low income to retrofit their homes so that those who are dependent, for example, on solid fuel systems can make those changes at 100% support from the taxpayer. We are also putting money back into key infrastructures that will make a difference. For example, 10% of the money was allocated to new investment in cycle infrastructure. And when you see this fund will aggregate over time, it will over the period to 2030 represent a 6 billion money will be raised from carbon pricing. And that is a very significant leverage to help people, to empower people to make the changes in their lives. But there's no pretending that this doesn't carry challenges for us. We have to, for a lot of us, we'll have to change the habits of a lifetime. And that's particularly difficult in areas, for example, like agriculture. there will have to be changes in adopting new practices, new farm practices.